Our first speaker is Frédéric Leroy. That's the agenda of today. The times have changed a little bit to give a bit more time to Frédéric. I think he deserves it. His presentation is going to be very interesting. I have listened his presentation several times, and it's always interesting. So yeah, I'm going to give you the floor, Frédéric. So Frédéric is a researcher in the Vrije Universiteit in Brussels. I will give you the floor and you can introduce just a few words from yourself because I cannot read you the thing, please. And you know the timing very well. So yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction and especially for the opportunity to speak here. So briefly, I'm a professor at Brussels University, and I'm a food science and technologist with a background in nutrition, but also in food processing, and I usually work with animal source foods. So I've been looking at the concept of the practice of animal production and animal processing, at least the processing of their foods, for several years now. And I would like to share a couple of reflections that I have on the future of this sector. And you all know that this is a very polarized space. It tends to lead to very heated debates. And the reasons for that are multiple. Well, I think they are at least threefold. And the first one is to be situated within academia itself. So we see that there's a radicalizing discourse within academia, which has to do with increasing influence of ideology over certain scientific outcomes, and white hat bias, which is present in some of the scientists. White hat bias essentially is the zealous intention to do good, which sounds benign and is starting from good intentions, but it will not necessarily lead to benign outcomes. And that's because it tends to amplify ideological distortion and shift us away from the rigor we need in the scientific debate. And I may as well be guilty of that myself, to be honest. But we see that it plays out in the field of ethics, of course, but also planetary health and human health. On the left side, you see two tweets that came out of Oxford University's account on Twitter, where they claim, or at least suggest, that we should all become vegan by 2050, and that a vegan diet is the single biggest way to reduce our impact. Now, those two statements are, of course, completely hyperbolic and go beyond what the conversation should be from a scientific point of view. On the right side, you see an example related to nutrition and human health. Now, the focus is mostly on red and processed meats, as you know, but some scientists take the position that we should avoid all animal source foods for everybody, including children. Now, this is a debate I had with Neil Barnard in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. I don't have time to go into its elements here, but I'd be happy to send you the papers if you're interested. The second dynamic has to do with policymakers and those billionaires that are now claiming to be part of the policy space. And it's not a new dynamic as such. It goes back several decades, at least to the late 1960s. One could argue that it goes back to the 1930s or even to the 18th century, depending where you put the first emergence of technocracy and technocratic views. But in the late 1960s, there were several initiatives related to anxieties about population growth. So Richard Nixon in '69 ordered a report which was executed or delivered by the Rockefeller Commission on the future of the American future and population growth. And the conclusion of that report was that we should move towards what they called food from factories. And they explicitly also mentioned synthetic meats. And they realized that this was not going to be very popular, so they also talk about a lobby for the future and an interventionist method to do so. And that's the same period, more or less, as the Club of Rome and its limits to growth. That was 1972. Again, a Rockefeller person behind this, but also various others. And the idea here is that populations are increasing, resources are depleting, and that will create massive problems. And the whole mindset is one of, is a Malthusian one. So it's about Malthusian worldviews and how technocratic interventions top-down should orchestrate that in the most optimal way through interventionism and technological fixes. That's basically the whole mindset. And that's several decades ago. And you could argue that's maybe not all that relevant today anymore, but indirectly it may as well be, because we see that those same lines are being picked up today at high levels. Bill Gates famously mentioned that the rich nations should shift entirely, because it's always the hyperbole involved, entirely to synthetic beef. And we see several similar kind of reasoning and ideas showing up in all sorts of reports and high-level documents. This is Richard Branson making a similar claim. By 2050, he predicts that all meat should be either cleaned from lab, tissue engineering, or plant-based as an imitation meat. So in basically the next 2-3 decades, all these things should change. And a third dynamic is essentially a combination of the two former ones, where you have an obsession with metrics, because it's all about intervening, it's about measuring, changing. So metrics are essential, and also how we should use them and play them out. Now, metrics are useful. They're a core tenet of science. They're extremely important in the scientific method, but you should always approach them very carefully if you apply them. Because if you don't, it leads to very bizarre outcomes. In the field of nutrition, it becomes increasingly visible. Whatever was considered wholesome nutrition and good food, proper nourishment by our grandfathers and all the generations before that is now not necessarily the case anymore, because it has been recalculated and reconfigured, if you wish, through those metric approaches, and whereby all the complexities of nutrition, and the same is valid in the planetary health department, all the complexities of nutrition are reduced to a score, a color, or anything that is similar to that, based on premises that are very debatable. Again, we don't have time to discuss those premises here, but there's a lot of things to be said about this. And it leads to outcomes such as the Nutri-Score. On the top of the slide, you see foods that get a green score. They are suggested to be good for you. And you see things like zero sugar Coke, sugary breakfast cereals, but with just a little bit less sugar. Spring rolls that you have to fry, and so on. And at the bottom of the slide, you see foods that are no longer to be considered green or the best choices, on the opposite, or even moved into the red zones. Now, what's obvious here is that the bottom products are traditional foods. Those are the typical foods that culturally were very important, that our previous generations looked at as very valuable sources of nutrients and nutrition. And now they are reconfigured, recalculated, and they're no longer so. On the other hand, the foods on the top have the advantage that they're based on processing. So that means that you can play the algorithms. You can try to replace sugar with sugar replacers, fat with fat replacers. You can throw in a bit of cheap fiber, and you recalculate the scores, and you get into a better zone. Going back to the topic of today, what seems to be particularly promising in that space is the formulation of plant-based products, which, if you look at them, most of them are to be found in the fast food window. They often come as a fast food format. So they're always nuggets and sausages and burgers and so on. And essentially, they're building on the expertise of those same companies that were bringing the ultra-processed foods in the past, because it's essentially the multinational companies that come up with those kind of formulations. And they are an ideal manner of opportunistically making use of those scoring systems. It's once again not new. That's why it's always useful to know a bit of food history and how food and nutrition were looked at in the past. It's essentially the same thing as what was done with margarine and butter. Butter originally was the wholesome product, and it was replaced by something that initially was seen as an imitation, as an inferior product, as a fraud, as a toxic variant in some cases. You see it in the left figure. And then at some point it was marketed and it was repositioned. It was connected to progressive ideals. It was connected to better health, to modernity, and so on. And it became the better version. So it was an inversion of the value system. And if you look at what was being said at the time, it's not all that different as what is being said today. It's about promising something on top of what you would have as a baseline that is very comparable to the original product. So it looks like, it cooks like, and it tastes like, as you see here on this slide, it looks, cooks, tastes like the original one. It's better because of this and this and this reason. And that's exactly what we see today. Those are two labels. One is from plant-based imitation from Kellogg's. It says, it looks, cooks, tastes like meat. And this is from Beyond Burger. It looks, cooks, and tastes just like beef. So they're playing the same thing on the same idea. They just need to promise something else because the old narrative somehow is losing its strength. So what is added today is a layer of moral value. So the added value is generated by health and sustainability and all of that, but is also a very strong moral component. So that what is now good food also comes with moral overtones. This is a product that is an egg replacer, so it's an eggless egg, and you see that it's obviously very much ultra processed. It's based on protein isolate and refined oils and all sorts of texturizers. But they claimed it to be interchangeable with the product on the left, which is the original egg. And now this is made by Just is one of those many veg tech companies that are often situated in Silicon Valley. And so they come up with those new generations of food, and they're heavily promoted by such organizations as the Good Food Institute. And I just drop the name here because I think it's an interesting one. It's the Good Food Institute. So we're relabeling, defining what good food is supposed to be as compared to what good food was in the past. And good, of course, comes with that moral connotation. Because make no mistake here, what those people are trying to do is not to offer an extra choice on the market. It is about eliminating the original and introducing the new one and completely overruling the historical version of it. This is a quote from Pat Brown from Impossible Foods. He considers livestock as a prehistoric food production technology, and it has to be put out of business. And he says, well, it's that simple. And as funny as that is, it also is quite worrying because companies like Impossible Food and Beyond Meat are becoming very influential. Both companies got the highest environmental award from the United Nations Environment Program. And that makes one think. Because it's indeed not that simple as Pat Brown is claiming. It's a very complicated story, as a matter of fact, because livestock agriculture comes with both harms and benefits. It's a complicated affair, and what we really should be doing is try to minimize the harmful impacts, which obviously there is, and maximize the benefits of livestock agriculture, because if you just take out animal agriculture from the equation, you will never achieve a sustainable future that we're aiming at. It's a matter of inserting it or perfectionating it in sensible ways. This is just one graph, which I think is very important, but I don't have time to go into its details. I just want to point out that if you evaluate an environmental assessment, whether it be the impact on water use or land use or greenhouse gas emissions, there's always an important factor that people tend to underestimate, and that's that it has to be scaled for proper nutrition and the benefits it's bringing. So the denominator in this ratio here is kilograms of food or calories or kilogram of protein. Those are very reductionist views on what nutrition is. Even kilograms of protein is not all that informative. It's better than kilograms of food, but it is not giving you the entire picture. And that's a major issue if you look at how the data is presented today. This is a graph coming from the World Resources Institute, and you see here, it's one of the many, many graphs that circulate, a list of foods, their impact, and of course beef and small ruminants are the worst of all. But if you follow that kind of logic, you would have to accept that the ones on top are better if you see it as a ranking, and then you will end up with sugar and oils and starchy staples, which obviously aren't going to give you the proper nutrition that the world is needing, because what is really needed is adequate essential nutrition globally. And that includes the West, where we have deficiencies in some cases that are increasing. Think about iron deficiency in young females, sarcopenia in the adults, and many other ones. So there's an important aspect here, and that's that high nutritional value has to be factored in if you compare different foods and different diets. And we should get away from some of the a prioris and some of the given ideas, received ideas that we're having about what is the good food. This is an analysis done by people from GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And what they have seen is by ranking the nutrient density of foods is that those foods that are generally perceived as being the best foods for us, and we're talking about fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole grains, chicken, the ones that are prescribed by dietary guidelines, as good foods as they are, they're not necessarily the best ones for the nutrient uptake. The most micronutrient dense foods are organ meats, fish and seafood, dark green leafy vegetables, beef, eggs, milk. Those are the foods where you're gonna in their most packaged and bioavailable form find some of the most limiting key nutrients that we have to deal with worldwide. So if you were just gonna abolish this and replace them by those imitation foods, it's certainly not a given that would be without trouble. Actually, if you drop beyond a certain threshold of animal source foods, you make your diets less robust. And we see that if we look at national diets, if you go below 30% of kilocal intake from animal source foods, you see all sorts of deficiencies appearing. I would like also to give you this piece of information that even right now in the West, take the American diet. The American diet is more or less 30% of animal source foods per in the caloric intake, because most of the calories are coming from oils and starches and sugar and grains and those kind of foods. So if you go below that, well, you make your diets less robust. It's not being said that it cannot be done. It just needs careful approaches, nutritional knowledge, the means to do so, which is certainly not a given in the global South, but it's also not a given even in the West. So it's a risky approach if you go below that. That would need to be properly evaluated. And what we see on the contrary is that some of the more vocal public health nutritionists are arguing to drop this intake to a level of 0 to 14%. This is the planetary health diet from the Eat-Lancet Commission, or anything in that order of magnitude. So way below the threshold that I've just shown. And you shouldn't see that threshold as very absolute, but it's an indication, it's a warning sign. Have in mind that our ancestral diets in the hunter-gatherer window, which is, let's say, more than 95% of our time on Earth, and you could argue our evolutionary diet, and those were healthy populations. We know that those people were eating around, on average, 70% of kilocalories from animal source foods in a large window from 30% up to 95%, depending on the ecological zone. And that's not, my intention is not to say that should be the aim, but it at least shows you that it's not the target that we have to look at to reduce chronic disease. It's much more in the whole formulation of your diet and the proper balancing of all nutrients. So you can find all sorts of different solutions with lots of plants or little plants, as long as you respect certain good foundations. Now, what the Eat-Lancet diet is saying, that we should go to heavy restrictions on animal source foods, because beef and red meat in particular, but also potatoes, if you see here, are largely exceeding what they have defined as the health boundaries. And the health boundaries are once more one of those, simplistic reductionist metric systems. Of course, not everybody agrees with this. The Eat-Lancet has explicitly called red meat an unhealthy food together with sugar. There has been a very thorough assessment done by the NutriRex consortium to look at the quality of the evidence using the GRADE approach, which is a quality system to look at evidence. And they came up with the conclusion that, at least for health, so they don't pronounce themselves on the environment, but for health, they don't see a good reason why we should restrict red and processed meats. Now, that came with lots of emotional controversies, to the point that some of the actors in the anti-livestock department even tried to prevent publication of these papers, because they even, they violated the embargo on the paper, and they tried to lobby at the level of the editor of the journal so that it wouldn't be published. And the most active ones have been the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, led by Neil Barnard, who I mentioned before, with respect to the debate on animal foods and chronic disease, and the True Health Initiative, on which board of directors you'll find Walter Willett from Harvard, which is the first author of the Lancet diet. And that is problematic because it shows you that we cannot have anymore a balanced, transparent, and reasonable exchange of ideas. It has become a very aggressive one. Those two organizations are also part of a larger platform called 50 by 40. So that initiative wants to reduce livestock with 50% by 2040. And I would like to remind you, for those that have followed the United Nations Food System Summit, that 50 by 40, at least the CEO of that organization, was appointed as civil society leader within the action track to looking at sustainable diets. Now, let this sink in for a minute. Civil society, that means everybody in society at large, was represented by this kind of organization, where you have all kinds of animal rights groups together with some very radical organizations under one platform, representing here civil society in one of the most important, maybe the most important action track within the Food System Summit, which, by the way, was led by the founder of EAT as the chairperson, and many other people in that track were in the periphery of the EAT Lancet network. Now, various people were afraid that this would lead to very imbalanced outcomes. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons, which we cannot discuss now, but for a variety of reasons. And one of them being strong opposition from people like the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and certain academics, where they pointed to interference and worrisome unilateral lobbying work, and also the point of ultra-processed foods. You see it here in the box below. So ultra-processed foods were dragged into the whole setup by such organizations as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and others. So that was hugely problematic. It's not going to finish here. I want to just give you a couple of highlights that may show up on your future timelines, because the chairs of the various action tracks have now recombined in something they call the Food Forward Consortium, which will go ahead and take this work further. And they have affiliated, just to close the circle with one of my first slides, with the Club of Rome, bringing in again that same mindset of Malthusian urgency and so forth. The way they're going to do it is by through metrics, looking at metrics and tools that will affect investment dynamics and the investment community through such initiatives such as the Food System Economics Commission, where you see here EAT combined with the Rockefeller Foundation and some others. But there are many other ones. The World Benchmarking Alliance is another one, where EAT combines with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the United Nations. You have the Good Food Finance Network that explicitly says that they're going to take sustainable food systems to the heart of the finance agenda. And they have the means to do so. For instance, if you know that FAIR is involved, which has a huge influence over massive fluxes of investment money, and which is led by Jeremy Coller, who has said that his intention is to take out what he calls industrial livestock agriculture, whatever that means. And once more, WBCSD and EAT are involved. Another idea circulating is the IPCC for food. Now, this is a report from IPES Food that really has a good look at it, and they uncovered what is really behind that idea, and they traced it back again to the exact same actors, including the World Economic Forum and their affiliates. So some very interesting ways forward that we will have to watch and evaluate in the coming months, especially up to the COP. And I would like to, I don't know if I have still time and how much over, I may just be able to finish this very quickly. This is something important that I've been looking at recently. And this is the so-called global burden of disease study, which is led by Christopher Murray, which is also the last author on the Lancet report. And the Lancet report built on global burden of disease, as do many other policy documents. It's the gold standard worldwide for health evaluations. Now, the global burden of disease traditionally has always included red meat in its risk factors, but the effect has always been shown as a very small bar, one of the least important ones, at least the least important one of the 21 dietary risk factors. Now, in the news data set, however, this suddenly has changed, and the effect has been multiplied by over 30 times the amounts of death that can be now attributed to red meat, and it became the seventh leading dietary risk factor. And that's quite remarkable. And we were wondering what happened here. And then one of the reasons is that they claim, among other things, that they have changed those response curves. So as you can see in this graph, every single bite of meat you're taking now is considered to be harmful. So it has a harmful effect since its very first bite. Whereas before there was a threshold of safe consumption, and then you saw some statistically significant effects if you go above the threshold, and they have put that at 0, but without any justification. We found that very problematic because the evidence is absolutely not showing this. On the left side, you see the results from the PURE study looking at all-cause mortality, and this is actual data where there is no effect at all in the whole window of unprocessed red meats. And if there's anything happening, it may be a protective effect. Whereas on the right side, you see the modeled values, and that's completely in contrast. So what we did is, with a consortium of scientists led by Alice Stanton, we asked to see the evidence. And the evidence is absolutely crucial if you come up with this policy kind of documents. It took us it was a long and difficult road to get this published and to get the response of the people of the global burden of disease. And in their response, to our astonishment, they admitted that there's a protective relationship between red meat intake and hemorrhagic stroke. They admitted that the evidence with various outcomes is weak, and they said that they will deal with this in future GBD analysis. But however, in the meanwhile, this is being played out in many, many academic papers. It is being used in policy documents such as the national food strategy in the UK, and it just keeps us away from the robust scientific discussions that we should have. So to conclude here, what is seen as good food today is not the same as what the narrative has changed. So the whole notion of good food is shifting, and good is a moral concept. So it is essentially a moral clash between different worldviews. And there's things to be said from both sides or from all sides of that debate. But we should do that through proper conversation. Transparent, holistic, and evidence-based discussion is what we need, and not the mix of reductionism, technocracy, ideology, vested interest that we're dealing with today. We know that there's going to be a doubling down on the use of the metrics and their connection to legal mechanisms and the finance agenda. And I'm worried that radical change, as it's being proposed now, based on the uncertain premises that it's including in its assessments, may lead to damage within society, and particularly public health, but not only. And that is valid for the Global South. It may as well be valid for the West. And it's very regrettable that all this energy that is being wasted on all of this is not used for what we should be doing, and that's improve the food system to the best of our possibilities. We certainly can and we should do better than we are doing today. So thank you very much, and I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions. I hope I didn't pass my time too much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frédéric. Yeah, thank you very much again. It was very insightful presentation. I'm sure we have questions somewhere online or here in the room. Please don't miss this opportunity to ask a question. Okay, first of all.
Yes, thank you. A question. Are those people that create those new narratives, are they so good? Or are we, as old-fashioned animal people, so bad at creating narratives?
Well, they do seem to have a better access to the communication channels. That's obvious. I mean, if you look at mainstream media, we have done that actually. We have looked at mainstream media and we did some discourse analysis. And there has been a transition that took place since around 2005, 2006, whereby the messaging became more sensationalist. And that's driven by the dynamics within mass media. You know, mass media on its own is maybe another mechanism that I didn't discuss here. But mass media has its role to play here. So and the access to mass media clearly now is not a balanced one anymore. There's a lot of virtue signaling also, and a certain narrative that has taken the upper lead. There's fragmentation also within the animal sector. We have seen a lot of fragmentation, historically speaking, which is not the case in the anti-livestock department, because even the biggest competitors like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, they work together very, very closely. They all unite. They pump lots of resources, and they have tremendous budgets into specifically communicating and lobbying for their agendas. So it doesn't mean to say that the public at large is following that narrative. Let's make no mistake here as well, because it's a loud voice, but it's coming from a minority. It's heavily amplified, but it doesn't necessarily represent what the public is thinking. And my perception, my feeling is that still largely in the public, people do not fall for the narrative. You also see it in the way that those products are not really taking off. If you look at their growth numbers, they may be substantial, but they start from very small bases, and they're not really taking over as some of these people are claiming, because they're expecting it to take over animal source foods in the next 1 or 2 decades. So we'll see, but clearly, I think better communication is needed from within the animal sector.
Perhaps a comment as much as a question. Interest rates. We've seen the Open Foundation now withdraw some financing. We've seen Mr. Musk jump to Twitter to more real assets. Don't you think that increasing interest rates will lower interest in this long-term ventures in Impossible Foods and so much? Thank you.
Yes, that's one of the things with modeling and futurist approaches, and seeing the world as a video game and coming up with models that will solve everything. What they underestimate is change. That's why the whole Malthusian idea is not a very good one, because it underestimates change. Sometimes radical things happen, a war, a pandemic. And those effects are so substantial that they make the old calculations and the old approach useless. So if we're now going to move towards high interest rates, collapse of supply chains, and so on, what you will activate is the deeper fundamental needs that humans have. Because the essential in the hierarchy of needs, the deeper needs are the ones to survive. That means having good food, having a house, and those priorities will be put back on the table. And whatever came out of a position of comfort in the urban West will seem less relevant. And the urgency will be on the primary needs that people feel and sense. So it may be a game changer. Yes, what is happening now, all the major disruptions we're seeing may be a game changer for how the narratives are playing out. Absolutely valid comment.
Yes, yes, Frédéric, I was wondering, I've been looking at that. One thing that we heard from the Animal Agriculture Alliance is that they said that somewhere in the, I do not know exactly when, in the 70s or so, there has been from a vegetarian group of people said that they wanted to change the agenda and that they have organized themselves quite well. And following on that, we had the Tugny Trust heritage, which was 46 million. And when that money was spent, we had the Open Philanthropy Project money from the Facebook initiators. And the Facebook initiators know, of course, everything about everybody. And so that is maybe the big money behind it. And they may want to mean well. On the other hand, you have from India in the 1970s, people going to India, and in the highest part of the society, people in India are vegetarian, but also they are able to have people look after their food and do all the work that's needed to give you a good vegetarian diet. So, and that coming to the Western world is also on the higher parts of the society. And then with religion disappearing, then there is maybe the need for an alternative. And I've read another article where people wonder whether the new religion is the food, and that is the new morale for people to feel good about. But then I come back, and just a simple person, and my mother said, never lie, is just, do the people, because these people have the right, the democratic right to say whatever they want, even if they know everything about this. But does the modern citizen also have the right to be balancedly informed, and do, apart from us, we need to be honest, do also the NGOs have the duty to be balanced? And what is your opinion about, do they also, can we call upon them that they should not use outdated science from 1980s, and like you said with your scientists, that they just use fluffy things and throw that up because of emotion, and how you think we could organize ourselves?
Well, in an ideal world, certainly, but I'm afraid that will not happen. Now, that's where my role is, and other academics, that's to bring out the science and to counter all the misinformation. It's a very difficult job because you need to elaborate substantially. That's why we also have created a website just to address the main facts. It's a very difficult job because it's easy to drop the slogans. It's much more difficult to contextualize them. So that's the job of the academics. Now we always had the distortion of facts to further agendas, whether they be ideological or driven by vested interest. Ideally, that wouldn't exist, but I'm afraid reality shows that it will always be there. And you mentioned a couple of historical mechanisms that are absolutely playing out today. The Open Philanthropy Project, for instance, is pumping big budgets into The Guardian. And The Guardian has this series called Animal Farms, which continuously pictures animal livestock agriculture under its worst image. So those are massive forces. And calling them and correcting them all the time is like bringing water to the sea, right? Or it's not easy.
Thanks, Frédéric. Really appreciate the presentation today. Really insightful and a different way of looking at different things. A question I've got is that we've talked about changing the narrative. We've talked about should we say, coming together collectively, which I think is, should we say, like you say, more of a long-term goal or an aspirational goal. If in the context of people in this room, people online, we're really talking about two major, shall we say, groups of stakeholders, people like yourselves, people like my colleagues here that are working in, shall we say, livestock related academia from a European perspective, or people who are associated with animal breeding and food systems, or working directly with producers. In your opinion, what are the, so shall we say, you can't change everything in one day, but what would you say are the key 2-3 takeaways for those stakeholders in the room or online today that will start something to make a difference or counteract this? Or I think counteract is the wrong word. It's not about being defensive. It's about, should we say, advancing the conversation. So really, what do you think are the tangibles that, for want of a better term, that you're doing right now that we can, shall we say, help with and to advance the conversation? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wish I'd known. It's only just my opinion, of course, but what I think is vital here, because what I did today is showing you some of the, the mechanisms. This is not shouldn't be the point. This is something that you have to keep in mind. It's not something you should act on. It's impossible to act on all of this. It's too massive. and it's not the best approach. I'm personally much more in favor of, as you said yourself, much more in favor of everything that is proactive, active, not the reactive parts, starting from the strong points. And the whole issue here, the reason why there's traction for those kind of radical ideas is because there's a huge disconnect. There's a huge disconnect between what is happening in practice, in the daily practical realities of livestock agriculture, and what is being perceived and known within the urban centers of the Western world. There's a huge disconnect. And it all starts from there. Because if you have that disconnect, you cannot scale facts, and you cannot grasp the implications and the truth value of all of this. All efforts, I think, should go in filling up that disconnect. And that's complicated because it has to do with many things. It has to do with the distorted animal relations framework, human-animal relations. They need to be fixed, because it's too much of a commodity view that is prevailing. So something has to be done there. Agricultural education, so that kids will know where food is coming from. They have to be shown how it's produced. They have to see a farm. They have to see the animals. They have to sense, smell, understand them. And if that is not being done, it's going to be a hopeless discussion. Because the more we get that disconnect in place, the more we will accept those bizarre ideas that food can come from a bioreactor, or it's hugely problematic. So I think it's not maybe within the conventional agendas of people that work in livestock agriculture, but it should receive, in my opinion, the highest priority. Because if this is not addressed, there's nothing to build on.
Yeah, just a question. Thank you very much for this quite worrying overview. But do we have any allies that could help us to combat this battle? Thank you.
Yes, fortunately, yes. And we've seen that also in the United Nations Food System Summit. That's because some very influential people have stood up and took their responsibilities. So there certainly are. You'll find them in those organizations that are dealing with low and middle income countries, because those organizations still perfectly understand the vital role of livestock agriculture. They may be in the mindset of, a lot less meat and a lot less, but those are reasonable people. You can discuss with them, and they understand the critical value of livestock agriculture. And then the discussion will be about the sweet spot. Where does it have to land? I mean, that's a difficult, complicated academic discussion that we should have, but it's taking us away from the radical views, because those people are very, very sensible. So you'll find them in those kind of organizations. You'll find them in the FAO. You'll find them in, of course, you have ILRI as well. There are transnational organizations as well that are, very, very, very much, of course, buffering against all the extremism.
Frédéric Leroy talking. My background is I'm a consultant for setting standards for the supply chain partners on livestock and how to verify quality assurance, animal welfare, and all these kind of things. Looking at the issue from a consumer point of view, I'd like to address that jungle of labels. I call it jungle of labels on the final product, and also the confusion that is created by consumers when they are in the supermarket, standing in front of the shelves and being confused by this high number of labels. And I would like to ask about Nutri-Score. I liked your comments on the not well balanced approach of Nutri-Score. So what is your advice when it comes to livestock and aquaculture, breeding and production systems and partners in that chain? How could we approach all these label setting ideas and processes in order to bring up our protein supply into a better light?
Well, I'll give you the The pragmatic view, and I'll give you my personal opinion, they're not necessarily the same. The pragmatic view is, of course, that you will have to play the game. You'll have to play the game because that's what is going to be pushed by policies in the next years. Labels will be there because it's, again, because we're in this mindset of quantifying and trying to reduce value to something that is tangible, a number. So that's going to be the framework. The way to do it and to valorize animal foods will be by playing on their nutritional value and correcting whatever impact there is by factoring in the nutritional value. Because why are we eating them except for the cultural reasons and except for the fact that it creates livelihoods and certain ecosystem benefits? The reason why we're eating them as well is because they give us very valuable nutrients. Those need to be factored in. They're never factored in those Nutri-scores and so on. They never factored in. They don't talk about vitamins and minerals and all sorts of bioactive compounds. So that needs to be factored in if you want to do it properly. And that's valid for the eco scores as well. You know, you cannot talk about CO2 emissions if you just look per kilogram of food. You have to factor in how much nutrition that brings you. So that's the pragmatic point of view. You have to play that game, and you have to play on the algorithms like the other sides are playing on the algorithms to obtain the benefit for the products you want. Now, of course, my point of view would be that you have to do that honestly and based on good science. But another point of view I have is that I find it very peculiar that humans are the only animal out there that needs to be informed about what foods we should eat. We have to think and calculate what is good for us rather than just naturally go what is our species adapted diet. And it's very peculiar, and it creates lots of trouble because people are extremely confused and they're not listening to what their body needs. They're listening to what the label is saying. So I'm very much not in favor at all of labeling of foods if they're trying to push people in certain directions. I think we should leave people alone in their food choices. I'm very much a proponent of liberty of choice. As much as I'm an opponent of ultra-processed foods and whatever comes with that, still, I don't think we should interfere through labeling with people's food choices. I think you need to fix that in different ways. How you fix it, I think you have to fix commensality, you know, eating together, restoring certain food traditions that have shown to be valuable in the past, adapting them to the new challenges, but fixing production systems, and so on, and create a food culture bottom up that will lead us to good foods, not a top-down one that through labels tries to bring us to specific places. Whatever came out of dietary advice since the late 1970s has failed enormously. Since the dietary goals for Americans came out, chronic disease has been on the increase. We haven't seen a single year where things go better, and they keep on getting worse.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Frédéric. Your agenda is full. That's why you are not with us here today. So thank you very much for attending online. Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me again. Have a nice day. And
yeah, thank you very much. I can see you very soon in Brussels, likely. Bye-bye. Thank you.